welcome to the MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Hey everyone, we're glad you could tune in today to listen to our conversation on the MessianTics, and we just wanted to say thanks for listening. This is now about 6 months, right at 6 months of episodes we've been releasing, and we're kind of discussing and have decided to move into not a newer direction, but a little more focused direction. For the past year almost, we've been discussing a lot of different things, whether it's issues within the Messianic movement, different controversial topics that pop up in every denomination, not just the Messianic wing of the body. But we've decided we're gonna focus more on having those hard discussions about issues and decisions that need to be made that are going to better help the Messianic movement to actually move forward as a grounded, functional body of Messiah. And so in order to have that, some of those discussions need to be had. So that way people are thinking, we want to encourage you to think about some of these issues. And, if you're leaders, to have those thoughts and discussions with your elders, with your boards, make those decisions. And if you're in a congregation, and if you, if you're given a voice at things like, if your congregation happens to have congregational meetings and things where everyone can kind of speak up and bring up things that may need to be changed or issues, then bring those up and have those discussions with your leadership, with your families, with your elders. But that's a little more the direction the podcast is going to go. Not that we're not going to continue to talk about some of the other things that we've talked about already. We're never going to get away from theology. That's just who we are. But we're also we want to dial in a little more to what we are. We are the MessianTics, and there are a lot of antics within the Messianic movement, and we want to kind of help narrow those down and help people to be thinking about processing and making executive decisions on actually getting those things carried through.
And with that, I just want to say we're not going to pretend like we have all the answers.
No.
Or that we've seen all of the problems, but we do feel the best way to find solutions is to actually have conversations and recognize when there are problems or when there are issues that need to be addressed for betterment. And so that's kind of our hope and our goal, is just to have open and organic dialogue on some of the things that we see. And there may be more, and there may be things that we're blowing out of proportion, but things that we see that we would like to see better for the further future of the movement.
Yeah, and now that we've had about 6 months of recording and talking, we kind of feel confident that that's the direction we should go. I was joking earlier about how we've kind of spent the last half year finding ourselves, if you will, because we kind of have had to.
Yeah, launching something new. You got to kind of figure out what it's going to be.
Yeah.
And this week we're talking about...
Oh, yeah, this week we're going to be discussing... Yeah, sorry. I was totally going to let you jump in and take that.
No, I was fine. I just was. I didn't know. I was waiting for that to segue into this.
Sorry. So anyway, we are going to segue into today's conversation, which is going to be focused on a topic that is near and dear to our hearts. As before we started recording, we were having discussion, and Rabbi Eric was saying, we're all very much. We love the Messianic movement. We want to see its future grounded. We want to see its future made certain in the right leadership and the right decisions by not only leaders, but also the people who come every week, people who serve in ONEG lines, people who volunteer and take out the trash. We want to see all of their futures secured, and that. So part of our conversation has been the necessity for the Messianic movement to embrace a different method of organization and leadership style that will allow for the future to be that grounded and secure thing. So And kind of the conclusion we've come up with thus far is that we need to move from a fellowship model, which most of the Messianic organizations are kind of based around being a fellowship, not a, and I guess we'll use the word denomination just because everyone knows what that is, and it will simplify things for us. But moving from a fellowship model to a denominational model, and so, what is a fellowship model? Do any of you want to jump in on that? Like, when someone says a fellowship model, what do you think about when someone says that?
So in my opinion, and this is from my experience and observation, from my experience, a fellowship organization is one in which, in the case of a congregational atmosphere like we're dealing with, congregations and leaders within those congregations voluntarily come under the umbrella of fellowship with other like-minded congregations or leaders, and there's not as much a hands-on involvement in the individual community, the individual congregation from the greater organization, the parent organization, the fellowship organization, as you would see perhaps in denominations. For me, I think one of the biggest things is you see a lot less intentional accountability from the parent organization, the fellowship organization, to each individual congregation, as you would see maybe within a more traditional denominational approach, in which there's a governing organization that you are aligned with, and there's representation, and you're communicating back and forth. And at least within and I'll speak to like the way the IMCS works. At least within the IMCS, you're a congregation for a certain period of time. Like, you have to start a congregation; it has to exist for a certain period of time before it can come under as part of the fellowship of the IMCS. As opposed to where I think 40 years into this, we should be, instead of bringing in new congregations solely. Now, I think those happen on their own organically, and there needs to be a way for them to come in. But I think we should be intentionally sending people out to start congregations. We should be involved in starting congregations. We should be at a place where we're vetting congregations before they exist, rather than bringing them in to vet them, and so on. So that's just a loose thought, and there's more that go into it than that. I will say one perk, though, to a fellowship is a lot less financial obligation from the individual congregations to the greater organization. But I also think that the financial obligation, the increased financial obligation of a more denominational role, would greatly benefit in some of the areas we're going to address in what we anticipate to be a series of several episodes in having this conversation.
So I think that you just brought up something that I find significant to this discussion, and it really points out the difference between the fellowship model and a denominational model. And you said it in your statement that the fellowship model has the advantage financially of not costing the congregation as much, where the denominational has the advantage of having more funding requirements, which bring about more changes and more things happening. The reality is that much of what has been done in the Messianic movement, and I say this as someone who's started 7 congregations and done things in that way in this fellowship model, is that because we started as individual congregations that then joined something that existed, we're much more focused on ourselves than on the greater. And so when we look at it and we say, if we become denominational, it will cost us more money, that's the mindset of this fellowship idea of individuality versus unity, where if your mind changes and says that as part of a group, a denomination, if you will, our offerings become part of the betterment of the whole, that accountability, that responsibility changes in the format to protecting what's mine to building what's ours. And I think that that's a big part of this conversation.
Yeah, definitely a my kingdom versus the kingdom. And again, I don't know that that's necessarily the attitude of those leaders. I don't think it's necessarily an intentional, this is my kingdom.
Sure.
But I think there is sometimes, because our our sight is focused on what's immediate to us.
Yeah.
We have a vision that only goes so far. Like we can't see the bigger picture because what's in front of us is so immediate and so sometimes dire financially.
Yeah.
I think of congregations, just looking at our experience at CMC, I think our congregations have been affected by hurricanes here in the last few years. There was definitely a couple of months there where my entire and almost every conversation I had with other leaders was about the distraught of the hurricane damage and we went 10 months without our building. Every conversation was, this is what we're going to, and I, for several months, didn't see anything else going on. And then all of a sudden we kind of come out of that, our world kind of comes back together and it's like, I missed a lot. There was all of this other happening. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's that need for a greater sight of what's happening, a greater picture. Toby?
I just want to ask a question before I make my point.
Yeah.
So the question is, and it shouldn't take a whole lot to answer, but are we talking about calling Messianic Judaism a denomination, or do we just want to take how they run a denomination and just take some of those elements?
I think we're using the term denomination here to explain what Messianic Judaism needs to become something with those.
The answer is yes. Yeah. We don't know whether or not denomination is the right term or not, because in Messianic Judaism people get a little uptight about terms.
But I understand why.
But the idea is we're suggesting we should move from a soul fellowship model to more of a denominational structure.
I understand the problem with the soul fellowship structure just simply from witnessing firsthand, mainly with a lack of accountability. Mm-hmm. I think.
Yeah.
And just to give you some examples, for instance, if something is going on unsavory with finances, or if something is, if there's no transparency with a congregation about finances. Another one is when certain situations, criminal situations happen within congregations and the leader tries to handle it in-house. Biggest mistake.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think one of the first lessons you should learn as a leader is there are certain things that happen in your congregation that you cannot handle in-house.
Yeah.
Again, I have to plug that Mars Hill podcast. Just listen to that. There's so much about what you shouldn't do in leadership.
Yeah. Can I tag on to that?
Yeah.
That I think that's probably the biggest lesson we've learned. That, and I was having this conversation with a family member this weekend, that if we've learned anything from evangelical America in the past 2 decades, it's how not to handle criminal things in-house.
Well, and I think that comes from a distorted view of their own authority.
Yeah.
And so as far as the denomination thing, I think that for Messianic people, it is an uptight thing, and it's a taboo subject. And the reason why, and it is for me, and I'm Messianic, so why is it when I hear denomination, I'm like, I don't know how I feel about that. I definitely agree with taking some of those elements. But when you start talking about denominations, because for me, Messianic Judaism was returning to a time before denominations, I think, muddied the water of the body of believers. And I think that was what it is for a lot of people. I think especially a lot of people who come from, God calls from the church. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean calling from the church because they weren't saved when they were in the church, because I was just as saved as you guys were, as anybody else was when I was in the church. But God called me to this expression of faith, right? But for me, it was a return to something more biblically genuine, and something like from the book of Acts. And there was no denominations then. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly we have all these denominations. So when you tell someone who's Messianic denomination, I can understand why that would be something that would be like, I don't want to hear about that because I got away from that.
Yeah.
I got away from Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Catholic. Yeah. I got away from all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we really have to kind of define denomination just a little bit, because while I agree there were no denominations such as Baptist, Presbyterian, and so on, there was the House of Hillel and the House of Shammai. There were Pharisees and Sadducees. There were groups that were grouped together by a common set of beliefs that governed them as a group. I think part of the reason that I want to see something akin to a denomination within the Messianic movement is because it will actually determine in some ways who's in and who's out. In other words, as long as we're just a fellowship organization, anybody can put up a shingle and say, I'm Messianic, and the whole world just puts them in and says that's part of that, regardless of educational qualifications of leadership, regardless of teaching, statements of faith, of vision for it, of all of the craziness that goes on in the extended Messianic movement. It also gives us the accountability, and Toby was absolutely right when it comes to governing and judicial things, not having a mechanism outside of our community that handles things like what happens if the rabbi gets addicted to drugs. And I'm not even saying intentionally, and understand that I happen
the opioid epidemic exists not because somebody was looking for it, but because it was prescribed.
Right. There's actually a congregational leader that I know, actually two, one within the Messianic movement, one outside, who were in car accidents. They got put on opioids and they got hooked on it, and it wasn't like I went out intentionally to go get this, but both of them are addicted to, or at least were addicted to opioids, and there's no mechanism outside of the individual body to assist with that. And I'm not talking even judicially to come in and say we're casting you out, but to have a process to assist that leader to walk through what he's dealing with, at the same time to protect, to teach, to share, to govern the body in a way that helps. So having these things, I cannot tell you the number of questionable things that have happened over the years that there's no means to deal with from a governing judicial way. And on the other side of that, there's really no means. Again, Rabbi David, your congregation went through a significant... Now, we had hurricane damage here, but our building wasn't destroyed. We're still dealing with insurance companies. But your building was largely destroyed. If there was a denominational type structure within the Messianic movement that unified congregations, there could have been a mechanism to assist you more readily. I mean, there were those that did.
Yeah, I will say that's another perk to the fellowship side of things, is that because it's voluntary, there's a when you have the denomination structure, there's kind of this felt obligation to buy into certain programs. With the fellowship model, there's a felt desire to participate in things. And so with our congregation, and there's one in Fort Myers that went through it this past year, that there were numerous Messianic congregations that made financial donations to assist in getting our building back up and running, that helped. Several gave in a way that allowed us to help other people restore their lives after the hurricane and things, and because of some of this, we were able to help feed the community some and things like that. So there's definitely a heartfelt desire to participate in that. But having a mechanism that just kind of automatically kicks in when disaster occurs or what have you, and this is. And I don't think we've actually gotten, when we say this is going to be multiple episodes, I think it's because we never really get around to where we really want to go.
Sure.
So eventually we'll get around to where we really want to go. But I think this is another big part of it is, and I'm not going to name names. I try not to name names, especially in negative situations. But I try not to name names. But there was a congregation that we're all familiar with that in recent years had several big trials that they went through, and not legal trials, but like travesties that they went through. Yeah, crises that they went through. And in the midst of some of the crises that was already existent for the rabbi, there was somebody in their leadership team and their elders team that actually tried to physically perform a coup and take the congregation over, even to the degree of, if I remember correctly, locking the doors while the rabbi was, or changing the locks on the doors while the rabbi was out of town, so that when he came back for service that weekend, couldn't get in, and things like, I mean, just really, they were legally trying to swap all the paperwork and everything over. I mean, it was a real mess. And there were those that were able to step in and help, but there wasn't, in a denominational situation or something more akin to a denomination. Again, I don't necessarily like the word. It's not the best word, but it is what it is. I mean, in fairness, Messianic Judaism isn't the best terminology either.
Yeah.
So, because all of Judaism has a Messianic expectation. But nonetheless, in the case of this particular congregation, if there had been a denominational structure set up, then the denomination would have had a mechanism to be able to step in during these crises that were in a lot of ways prohibiting the rabbi from being able to be as proactive because of outside crises, being able to be as proactive in discerning some of the crazy going on because he was already dealing with his own stuff. And the denomination could have a mechanism step in and say, hey, you know what, you're going through something pretty serious. We're going to bring a rabbi in to serve in your pulpit for you for however long you need, or bring in a series of rabbis so that you can focus on all of this stuff going on right now, and we'll protect you. We'll be that rear guard that will defend you.
Take a sabbatical.
And then even at that wasn't able to play out when the turmoil was happening and the split was attempting and the coup was happening. There wasn't a mechanism in place to step in and solve that problem. Or at least assist. And so the congregation came out okay in the end. They lost some people, but it panned out better for them in the long run. Things have gone really well. And there were those that voluntarily, like I said, heartfelt, that voluntarily stepped in to assist and to help right the ship and rebuild and what have you. But I think that's a big need, like to have an organizational structure that is actively involved, that is actively and the beauty of the way things are set up, at least, and I'm going to speak solely to the IMCS model because this is where we're most familiar with. I'm a part of the UMJC as well, and they have their own model, and it's also kind of a fellowship model, but they have their own model as well. But in the IMCS model, the beauty of the way things work is that each congregation has virtually full autonomy, which is great in terms of building a congregation as an identity that meets the identity of the community, that is able to serve the identity of the community they're in. It's great for being able to establish their own theological opinions and positions and so on. But the downside is that there isn't a baseline for all of the congregations, even down to education and leadership development and so on and so forth.
Or what a worship service looks like.
Yeah.
I think that on top of this whole process that we're going through, a fellowship style structure generally results in a reactive response to situations where a denominational in other words, back to the hurricane situation, if in a denominational structure there's money that's given on a regular basis that goes into a fund so that should something happen, there's immediate assistance that's available. Where in a fellowship organization type thing, it's set up so that when something happens, the word is set out and then people can give. And honestly, you can do both of those. And at our congregation, there's been many times, especially early in our congregation, where we didn't have any money in the bank. And every time something happened, we'd have to say, okay, guys, the air conditioner is broken. We got to raise up money. Let's do this and get it together. But it's much more, I'm not going to say calm, but comforting, I guess, in a way to say we have X amount of dollars in the bank in our emergency fund so that should an air conditioner go out, should the plumbing need to be fixed, should something happen, we're not having to go out and try to beat the bushes to gather funds together to do that. And that's not just in the financial realm, but also in the place of if something happens within, let's say somebody has a stroke or has a car accident or something. In a denominational structure, there's a means to say, okay, we're sending so-and-so in to cover the pulpit during this period of time, where in a fellowship organization, it's who can we find that's available to do this?
Yeah. Or it's a fend for yourself situation.
Or fend for yourself situation.
Which tends to be the more
right.
common scenario.
So those are the things. If
we'll pray for you.
Yeah, or if you need a youth leader, if you're in a fellowship organization, your choices are whichever young person happens to be in your community that may have some kind of calling or at least a leadership ability that people will follow them. Where in the denominational structure, you can reach out through the denomination and say, look, we need somebody to run our youth group or our children's program or whatever. And there's a pool available of opportunities.
And I think that there has to be a balance, because when I think of, to your point, Eric, about raising people up in the congregation, I think that ideally, at least in my opinion, ideally you want to raise people up within your own congregation. It doesn't mean you always have what you need, but ideally you would want your youth in your congregation to be led by someone that has been there and that they know, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you have to hire a youth leader, and I've seen, I know someone, a worship leader, and he's really good, and he was hired by a great congregation, and he moved to go lead worship there, and so it doesn't always work out that way, So I think that it's important. I think working in those elements, I think, is important, because there are advantages, as David said, to having a fellowship and having that autonomy. The problem is that I just think that we're all the way in the Messianic movement. We're all the way on one end of the spectrum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I was going to say a perfect example of what you mentioned is we've been now out of COVID lockdowns for 3 years. Or is it 2 years? 3 years.
I think it's 2 and change.
2 and change.
Well, it depends on what state you're in.
Well, we're in the free state of Florida and Alabama. We were free before a lot. Some of you who are listening probably were not set free from the chains quite as soon as we were. But we haven't reopened our prison ministry since 2020, just because the person that was the minister in charge of that hasn't. They had some life situations that caused them to need to step away, which is fine. But in a denominational model, or I guess kind of like what you're saying, like something on a spectrum that is kind of more balanced with I guess the structure and organization of a denominational model, we would be able to reach out to other congregations and actually maybe even bring down someone who could work because we have several prisons in the area, so it's not like they would be part-time in this thing. You could absolutely make this a full-time chaplaincy or something. So I think with that structure and that organization, we could have potentially found someone a lot sooner.
And I think that's one of the headaches that we run into sometimes is because we're not as deeply connected. We're fellowship, you're connected. There's a willingness, there's a friendship, there's a love, there's a brotherhood, however you want to word it, that's there. So there's an automatically assumed relationship that is supportive and defensive of each other. But at the same time, it's very much this is my world, and I let you into my world as far as I'm willing to, right? And so because of that mindset, a lot of times, I'm not saying always, but a lot of times it can be very difficult. While Rabbi Toby made a great point, our desire is to raise people up in our congregation, right? Because it's always better to have somebody homegrown to serve. But at the same time, when you do need, because sometimes there is a necessity to reach out. When you do need to reach out to bring somebody in, there's not a mechanism, and it becomes very difficult to do so because a lot of times the rabbis of other congregations just feel like you're just trying to take my talent, my people, it's sheep stealing. You're taking, this is really difficult because you're taking somebody that could benefit my congregation. And I'm not saying everybody has that attitude. And what's really sad is that sometimes the people you may be interested in aren't even being used in that community at all, or at least not in the capacity that you would see, like to use them, but they still, because they're their people, they don't want to let them go, and it makes it much more difficult. Not that, and I'm not saying that a more formal structure is going to solve that problem, but a more formal structure allows us to reach out to the organization and say, hey, I know that there's a job listing or a shopping list of rabbis or youth leaders or whatever. Can I would like to post a job need that needs to be fulfilled, and see if we can find the right candidate for that role. And then it comes from the organization down, rather than having to reach out to other leaders and try to figure out, okay, well, which pawn is just a pawn and which pawn are you looking at as a future bishop, and trying to figure this out. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and I guess, like, at least in my mind, the ideal for rabbis is, Yeshua had 12 very close disciples, is to have multiple. So at any given time, a congregation of good enough size should have probably 2 or 3 people under the rabbi who are sort of his students, who are people who he believes are capable, have that calling and that gifting. And then if that comes across the wavelength, I guess, the radio waves of, the Morse code of, hey, we need a leader over here, that he can be like, go through the however many students he has under him and be like, hey, pray about this. But there's a congregation that, rabbi just passed away. They didn't have an assistant rabbi, set up to take over. Pray about going and maybe stepping into that place of leadership and teaching. And that could be rather than a congregation falling apart. Because there's a lot of times where if it's, I don't want to say that we're isolated, but we kind of are. I mean, because again, like you said, the fellowship model breeds that air of, it's me and my world. And we've got, and because everyone has their things, we all have things we've got to deal with. We have people issues, we have teachings to do, we have services to conduct, we have ministering to people in hospitals and throughout the community. So we're busy, we're doing things. So it can be difficult to look outward, but whereas the denominational model does invite you to look more outside of your own, and invites others to be looking around more as well, because. Especially in the regards to leadership, because most of the time, where do we get our leaders? A lot of the time they are raised up locally, which is nothing wrong with that. However, if you have a congregation where there's really no one spiritually in a place where they can be or should be a leader or teacher, where where do you find, because a lot of the other congregations may not be aware that you're having a problem. And even if it gets put on an email chain or something like, hey, I'm looking for a leader, like everyone can pray about that, but all of those people, for example, in the Rabbis Forum, for example, they all have their things. They're all focused on their congregations and their things, as they should be. So, when it comes to looking for someone else to step in somewhere else, you don't have anyone who's working towards that.
And you actually bring up a very interesting point that I have had conversations with people about over the last few years, is with a more formal organization, a denominational style structure, whatever you want to call it. And I hate that I keep dancing around that term, but nonetheless.
Let's just pen it down.
Yeah. But because with a more formal organization, what you end up having, because we don't have this, if we're honest about it, we do not have this in the Messianic movement today, with it being solely fellowship models, is you don't have shepherds of shepherds, right? So each of us have, like, one of my the Rabbi David Rosenberg of Shuva Yisrael in Long Island, my wife and I consider our rabbi, because we served under him for 5 years in New York, and so we look to him still as our rabbi. And so I'll go to him when we have crisis, or I'll go to Rabbi Michael Wygant, or I'll go to Rabbi Eric Carlson, or to my dad, or a few other people, and say, hey, I'm looking for advice in this area. This is what we're going through, right? But they're not shepherds of shepherds per se. They're shepherds of congregations. And we need shepherds of shepherds, right? When you look at the priesthood served from 30 to 50, right? And after 50, they didn't stop serving. They just stopped serving in the service in the temple. They started serving by raising up new priests, by serving to spiritually nourish the priests that are active, by serving to take their experience and so on with others. When you have a more formal structure, you have the ability to have kind of like Rabbi Russ Resnick with the UMJC, who is in a role as, now he's also a counselor, but he's in a role where he is, I think his title is like rabbinic counselor or something like that. His role is to serve as a shepherd of the shepherds in the UMJC, as a rabbi of the rabbis in the UMJC. But one person can only stretch so far, right? And if we can get to a place where we're a little more formally structured, and we are building up leaders both within the local congregation, but also within the organization for the purpose of sending out to local congregations or starting new congregations. We're building up leaders. Then we can take the leaders who have spent decades building leaders up and have them serve in roles where they are now building those leaders who are already functioning. They can be shepherds to shepherds, so that when I have a crisis, like we've had over the last 6 months, 8 months in our congregation that we've come out of now, but when we have a crisis, I have somebody direct I can go to. Right? I don't have to call up somebody and go, hey, I know you have your own crap going on. Yeah. I know your congregation has its own problems. I know that your life's already kind of difficult. Can I throw one more thing on your plate? Can I take, on top of your 100, 150 people that you're already dealing with, can I throw my 70 on top of that? Yeah. And we can go to somebody and say, hey, look, I need a shepherd to shepherd me.
Someone whose sole job is to deal with and I'll plug this in just because it's my background, but the Army has its leadership structure, especially for line units, is set up the way it is, and I'm sure the Marines are a similar way because combat units are structured a lot the same. You psychologically in high tense situations, and not just like combat, but like dealing with getting people trained up and ready, the human mind can only deal with and or lead about 4 to 5 people. Like they did studies on this that like you can only handle 4 to 5 other people on your own. That's why when you break it down to the smallest unit in an infantry platoon is a fire team. So you've got a fire team. You've got usually a corporal or a sergeant. That's 4 to 5 people. Several riflemen, machine gunner. Then you have a squad. Squad leader's in charge of 5 to 10 people. So, as a whole, he's in charge, but he really only communicates with those 2 team leaders. So he's just in charge of those 2. Like those 2 team leaders are handling their 3 to 4 man teams, and then he's handling the team leaders. How many squads in a platoon? You got 4. So platoon sergeant is only really communicating with and dealing with 4 other people. So those 4 guys each have their breakdowns and who they're dealing with and what have you. And
that almost sounds like Yittro's advice to Moses: leaders of tens and hundreds and thousands.
It's very similar.
I want to bounce off of 2 thoughts in here. One is to clarify something I said earlier, which was when I was talking about raising up leaders. I absolutely agree with Toby that we should raise up from within our communities when we're able to. What I was talking about was if you have a community and let's say you have a group of young people, but there's nobody that really expresses a calling to be the youth leader. What a singular congregation and fellowship will generally do is say, okay, where's the rabbi's son? Okay, or the elder's son, or whatever, and whether they have a gifting or a calling or whatever, we put them into that position, or whether they're actually even living biblically. It's almost as if we feel like we have to have somebody, so we'll just grab somebody from within, because we don't have a mechanism to go outside and say, look, we don't have somebody gifted or called or even living to a position where they can be an example and a leader. Is there somebody I can bring in? But going off of what Jonathan said about prison ministry earlier, we have 4 or 5 prisons right here in our local area, but if you extend that out a couple of hours, there's several more prisons. If you extend it out a couple hours after that, there's even more. And we get letters almost every week from prisons that are outside of our reasonable driving distance. But if we as a denomination were to hire somebody who would be the prison chaplain and establish chaplains under them to help with that, that one person could go and do a whole region worth of prisons on a regular rotation and establish that, instead of our congregation trying to find enough people to go into 4 prisons or 6 prisons on a regular basis and so on. So the advantage, it goes beyond that. And again, I think that we should be involved in those things. Prisons, orphans, widows, that's our primary calling of ministry to deal with. But as fellowships, individual congregations, we all try to do what we can, and sometimes we fall short because we don't have the mechanism to do all of it. So we just don't do any of it. Where if we could work together on things, we could accomplish so much more in that way.
There's and And part of this discussion, and from what I've seen in my years, and Toby, I'm sure you kind of hinted at this, and I'm sure you can attest to it as well, that there is sort of this fear of the denominational model, I guess. And I think we're using denomination just because it's the best term we have to describe what we're talking about, but it may not be exactly what we go for, or kind of charging the Messianic movement with going for. But there is sort of this fear of organizational, being organized or having people at the top to disseminate. But the question I would pose, the question I am going to pose is, if you are so afraid of organized, quote unquote, religion, then why do you use and or read from the book of Acts, which is nothing but the Yeshua movement, organizing itself and becoming organized? I mean, half of that book is them making decisions about, basically making statements of faith. Yeah. Even going into the, hey, why aren't the Hellenist widows being fed? Like, what's up with that? Here, organize some guys, go to. So if you're coming, exactly. So if you're coming into a Messianic congregation, you've been burned by, if you're coming out of a church and you've been burned by the denominational structure of, whether it's the SBC or Presbyterian Church or whatever have you, you cannot let fear drive your walk and your allegiance to the movement, because you'll end up burning yourself and others, because and it's unrealistic too, because even in our literature that's sacred to us as Messianics, it's organized. It's an organized faith structure. Like, it's not just there. We're not just there winging it, with like, we got our Torah and our seat. We're just out here swinging around. Like, no, there was actual structure and organization to how they did what they did. Paul sent letters, explaining, hey, I'd like to come to your, congregation, and I'm going to come visit. And then people would pay for him to travel and give him gifts so he could continue to travel and do his ministry. And you can do that under a fellowship model, sure. But when you have someone at the top of the chain, it becomes a lot easier to say, things like, for example, can you imagine if a group or a city had not given Paul anything to go to the next city? That's when the Jerusalem Council could come down and say, hey, y'all being some selfish. Yeah.
Well, he actually had some problems though getting support too at times. Yeah. Which is funny because, and it's a subject for another episode. Yeah. But I'm just saying that Paul had some issues, because I think it might be in Philippians where he specifically points them out as being like, you're the only ones that gave, or. I'm trying to. I probably shouldn't have brought that up if I don't exactly know.
Philippians,
But he, which is funny because some people feel that they don't have to do that, or they don't, But anyways, he also had issues with that. Yeah.
So as we move towards closing this episode out, and again, we're going to hit on this subject for a few more episodes, but as we move towards closing this episode out, I actually want to talk to or ask a question of Rabbi Toby and Rabbi Jonathan as two guys who are currently in the ordination process with the IMCS and who have within the last few years moved into a rabbinic role. At this stage and where you are in walking in your calling and in developing your calling, what would you deem as the most valuable thing that you would like to see added for bettering raising up new leaders in the Messianic Jewish movement? What do you think would be the most effective resource that isn't there currently or needs to be drastically improved on in the Messianic Jewish movement?
If I can go first, especially young leaders need to be, and again, this goes to the strength of having the denominational model, which has the funding and the giving ability to do this. Young people need, because as it's currently set up within the IMCS, if you're a young person with a calling, basically you can, mail in order an application to become a Messianic leader. I'm not saying, like, again, given the history and the times, that's like it's worked up till now, and now I think we can do better. One thing I think that absolutely needs to happen is if you have someone who is brand new to leadership, and definitely if they're under the age of 30, they need to be moved or shifted to where at least part-time they are sitting under an active Messianic rabbi, someone who they can actually be a disciple of. And the denomination...
You're suggesting as opposed to just taking somebody that started a congregation and has now come under, now ordaining or working them into ordination.
And just having a phone call a month or just having a couple emails a month. And again, this goes back to the strength of the denominational model is actually taking a young person and the congregation can with its own money too kind of come up under this person and be like, hey, we're raising up a leader who may not stay here. He may not be the one who takes over for our rabbi now, but he's being trained up to go do something elsewhere. So you need to have, if we're going to make disciples, we actually need to make disciples, not pen pals.
Yeah, I like that.
I would agree with that. I think that having some more deliberate communication, and I think that, it's kind of petty, but the certificates when they say Messianic pastor versus rabbi and stuff like that. Sometimes there were times when I wish that was different, but I understand where they're coming from to a degree. But yeah, I agree with what Jonathan said. The other thing was just kind of a silly detail thing, but I agree with what Jonathan said. Other than that, I don't. There's nothing. As far as in the IMCS with education, it's not a whole lot you have to do, and I think it's like I don't want to be like the UMJC and require someone to basically go to med school to have the equivalent of that kind of education to be considered taken seriously. Because, otherwise, who did Yeshua pick to change the world? He picked a bunch of fishermen and stuff, right?
But they also walked with him.
They did, but what I'm saying is that it didn't, right, and it costed them, and not out of their pocket. It costed them in other ways. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
It's about a life walk and being a journeyman and things like that. I'm all for education.
Yeah.
I don't think you should be heavy-handed on no education. I don't think you should be heavy-handed on a bunch of education. I think, so.
If I can add this to.
Yeah, I was pretty much done.
Okay. Yeah. Again, strength of the denominational model. If you have the funds, there are scholarships. You can actually, and because I know there are schools that give Messianic students scholarships, but I'm talking about, like, for example, if you go to become a Catholic priest, like a lot of the time you go and your school's paid for by the whichever diocese you're under. Not all the time. But, if you become a priest or whatever student loans you took out or, debt you may have is then paid by the church at completion of a degree. So
yeah, that happens with the denomination that runs the school I did my undergrad at. Was if you go through their ordination process, get ordained, then they reimburse for or pay off your tuition.
Yeah, so educate, and I'm right there with you. I believe, like, if this is your calling, most of the time God does not call rich people to be
that's the problem.
Teachers.
Because that's the stupidity of it to me. I know that's a strong word, but the stupidity of it to me is we worship a Messiah who talked about giving away money, giving away agency, giving away leverage, giving away authority. He essentially removed himself from those things for us. Yeshua basically gave everything up for us, right, including his life. And here's how you can get in debt so you can learn how to lead his people. Yeah. And I think that's the stupidity of it.
Yes, it is.
So this is one of my big hearts for raising up a future for the Messianic movement is dealing with the education side and exactly how that should look and how we can do it. So I'm going to suggest, if you guys don't mind, let's actually pick that up on the next episode, because we said we're going to carry this conversation for a few episodes. Let's jump right into that and let's have some fun with it, because I've got a lot of thoughts there. And I'd like to bounce some of them off of you guys and see what your thoughts and hearts are on that as well.
So anyway, thank you all for joining us today. We hope these questions questions and answers and conversations have been encouraging to you and enlightening. We hope you all will think of them, ponder them, pray for us, pray for the future of the Messianic movement, and let's continue to have these discussions and grow together.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.